Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday, Yom Shishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Friday? Yehud in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck Guy in Ohio, Gordo in Scotland, Renee in Indiana. Belle checking in with her grandkids, Chala and Candy. Sounds like a great Shabbos ahead. Chaim in Florida, Moishi in Brooklyn, Aoife in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Double Daf. Moving right along. And you know, what's really special about these pages here in Tractate Zevachim, the laws of offerings, which we haven't been able to do in 2,000 years since the Second Temple was destroyed, is that clearly the only reason we're going deep on such complex and difficult laws is because we love Hashem so much and we want to come close to Him and understand His laws and this beautiful tradition that He established for us all the way back to Mount Sinai when He didn't lay it all out so clearly and invited us to join Him in fleshing out the law by being able to derive from in the areas where it's not explicitly given to us what the law should be as these questions come up from the clues that are given in some, in this kind of offering, that kind of offering. When can we extend from this offering to that offering, as we've been discussing this whole time? Okay, our dafs are 41 and 42 here in Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion, Mishna number 1 here in chapter 4. We picked this up about halfway down, page 41a. The Gemara comments, it is taught in a baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rav Papa. The verse in Leviticus 4:20, and he shall do with the bull as he did. It seems to be comparing the bull brought for an unwitting communal error, right? A sin offering because the community did something wrong, relying on an erroneous ruling of the Sanhedrin, to the bull that is brought on Yom Kippur, which is atoning not for the sins of the nation, but it's involved in the work of Yom Kippur, but the bull is actually for the sins of the priests, of the Kohanim, and specifically the high priest family. Okay, so the Gemara comments, it is taught in Bryce in accordance with the opinion of Rav Papa, and he shall do with the bull as he did. And what is the meaning of the verse when the verse states, with the bull? It is clear that this verse is referring to the bull. So the Baraisa answers, because it is stated with regard to the goats for an unwitting communal sin of idol worship. Right? The bull is when the community relies on a ruling of the Sanhedrin with respect to other matters. But if the erroneous ruling led to idol worship of Avodah Zarah, then instead of a bull, a goat is brought for that. Right, in regard to the goats for an unwitting communal sin of idol worship, quote, and they have brought their offering, an offering made by fire to the Lord, and their sin offering before the Lord for their error. Right? Intentional sins, we don't bring offerings. We have to achieve atonement in other ways. But sin offerings are brought for unwitting sins, right? Where you did not do it on purpose, but maybe through some negligence. Numbers 15:25. And their verse is interpreted as follows. Their sin offering, these are the goats for an unwitting communal sin of idol worship. Alluding to, in that passage, their error, this is the bull for an unwitting communal sin, which is brought for an inadvertent transgression of the community, relying on an erroneous ruling of the Sanhedrin. And the juxtaposition of these offerings in the verse, their sin offering for their error, indicates that the Torah means to say, their sin offering is for you like their error, i.e., all the portions consumed on the altar in the case of the bull for an unwitting communal sin are also burned on the altar in the case of the goats for an unwitting sin of idol worship. So the Gemara asks, with regard to the offering that is brought for their error, i.e. the bull for an unwitting communal sin, from where did you learn this law? Was it not via juxtaposition from the bull for an unwitting sin of the anointed priest? as the diaphragm and the two kidneys are not explicitly mentioned with regard to the bull for an unwitting communal sin. So if you're going to end up burning them on the altar, it must be that you learned it out from the bull that is brought if the anointed priest makes an error. But this is difficult, as does a matter derived via juxtaposition again teach another juxtaposition? Therefore, the verse states, and he shall do with the bull as he did with the bull for a sin offering. With regard to the first instance of the phrase with the bull, this is the bull for an unwitting communal sin. And with regard to the second instance of the phrase with the bull, this is the bull for an unwitting sin of the anointed priest. And therefore, due to this juxtaposition, it is as though the burning of the diaphragm and the two kidneys was explicitly written with regard to the bull for an unwitting communal sin. And therefore, the law can be taught by juxtaposition with regard to the goats for an unwitting sin of idol worship, as stated by Rav Papa. Now, the Gemara analyzes the previous Baraisa that we mentioned yesterday. The master said above, their sin offering, these are the goats for an unwitting communal sin of idol worship, which are juxtaposed in this verse to the bull for an unwitting communal sin. And the Gemara asks, but let the Tana derive this from the earlier verse stated with regard to the bull for an unwitting communal sin. As the master said in the Baraisa cited earlier, a sin offering, this serves to include the goats for an unwitting communal sin of idol worship. Rav Papa said this derivation was necessary as there were only the juxtaposition from as. If there were only the juxtaposition from Leviticus 4:20, it would enter your mind to say this matter applies only to the acts of sprinkling, which are written with regard to the bull for an unwitting communal sin itself, but with regard to the burning of the diaphragm and the two kidneys, which are not written with regard to the bull for an unwitting communal sin in itself, you might say that the law should not be derived from it. Therefore, this additional derivation of their sin offering teaches us that the two offerings are similar with regard to this detail as well. And now we're on page 41b. And look how often we have this little logical link, right, where a law seems to be coming and saying something that we've already learned. And so it seems unnecessary. And so the way that the Gemara explains why it is necessary is because, although it seems like it's repeating something that was already said, you might have thought that that law doesn't apply in such and such situation because it's a little bit different than the law that was already stated, and therefore you might have come out with a different outcome. Therefore, the law is repeated with this nuanced difference to cover this situation that you might have thought was not covered. And that's why it was necessary to state this seeming repetition, but with a nuanced difference, right? We see that a lot in this section. Now, Rav Huna, the son of Rav Nassan, said to Rav Papa, but the Tana said, with the bull, this serves to include the bull of Yom Kippur for all that is stated in this matter. This statement indicates that all the details which apply to the bull for an unwitting communal sin are extended to the bull of Yom Kippur by means of a single derivation. And Rav Papa responded, this issue is a dispute between Tanaim, as the Tana of the school of Rav amplifies the law through this juxtaposition, whereas the Tana of the school of Rabbi Yishmael does not amplify the law through this juxtaposition, but rather maintains that an additional derivation is necessary with regard to, are we going to burn the diaphragm and the two kidneys of the bull in the case of communal sin error, the same as we do the bull of the error of the anointed priest, the same as we do of the bull of Yom Kippur. New topic. The Gemara cites a statement that is related to the above laws. The school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, for what reason are the diaphragm and the two kidneys stated with regard to the bull for an unwitting sin of an anointed priest, and they are not explicitly stated with regard to the bull of an unwitting communal sin? Well, this can be explained by a parable, a mashal. It can be compared to a flesh and blood king who grew angry with his beloved servant for his misdeeds. But he spoke little of the servant's offense due to his great affection for him. Let's repeat that. right? We can learn the way that God relates with us in certain respects from the idea, the parable of a king who has a beloved servant, and the servant messed up, and he actually angered the king quite a bit. But the king is able to remember in the midst of his anger all the other times that the servant really did a great job, and because of that, the king is going to hold his tongue. And he's not going to complain and belittle and rebuke the way, he's a king, he can do whatever he wants, but he's not going to do that. Here, where the idea of that parable applies here, that, okay, God doesn't have to spell out each and every element of every sin offering that the people do because he loves us, right? Because he loves us. And so he's going to leave it to us to extend from one type of sin offering to another through interpretation. But here, this is the first time that we're getting a sort of a justification, a rationale for why these kinds of elements are not spelled out in every sin offering, every element of every sin offering. One idea is so that we can step in and do the interpreting and figure out when to extend and when not. But now we add this new idea that God doesn't, belabor the point about, okay, these are all the different things you're going to have to do for all the sins that you commit because you're going to screw up. And I know you're going to screw up and you're bound to screw up. And I'm not going to like it when you screw up. So I'm going to, list one after another, all the things you have to do. Okay, God says, you're going to screw up. And when you do, you'll make it right. And we don't have to dwell on it so much. And we're going to have another mashal. And the school of Rabbi Yishmael further taught, for what reason is it stated before the curtain of the sanctuary in Leviticus 4:6 with regard to the bull for an unwitting sin of the anointed priest, and, right, sprinkling before the curtain that separates between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. And this aspect of bringing an offering is not stated with regard to the bull for an unwitting communal sin, where it merely states before the curtain. Okay, so I think that shows that I was mistaken before, that it's not only the offerings of Yom Kippur that are inner offerings, but these bulls for communal sin and for the error of the anointed priest, and I suppose the goats that are brought for a communal error, communal sin with respect to Avodah Zarah, to idol worship, those are also inner offerings. Now we know that for sure. But the point is, not every element of every offering is spelled out. So why does God omit the details about the sprinkling on the curtain? Well, this can be explained by a parable. It can be compared to a flesh and blood king against whom a province sinned. Right? One of his provinces sinned against the king. So if a minority of that province sinned, so his relationship with his entourage remains, i.e. the king continues to treat his loyal followers in the usual manner. But if the majority of the province sinned, then his relationship with his entourage does not remain. And he no longer meets even those who remain devoted to him. Right? So as long as it's only a minority of the people in a particular area mess up, the king can keep his love relationship going with the devoted followers. But when the majority of that province is screwing up, then even the devoted followers who remain, they weren't able to keep the majority of the province on track. The king is, just got some ill will toward the province as a whole, since it's the majority that has sinned. And so the devoted followers lose their relationship with the king as well. And the idea here, I guess, that when we're talking about communal offerings brought for communal sin, well, that's when a majority of the public has made that mistake. And so, okay, the king is going to spell out what they need to do. The Mishnah teaches that all of the placements upon the inner altar are indispensable, right? As opposed to when an offering is a standard offering is brought of an individual, and it's a sin offering. Let us say it's a sin offering. It ought to have its blood sprinkled on the four corners of the outer altar, but as we've learned, according to the majority opinion of Beis Hillel, even if the blood was only sprinkled on one of the sides of the altar, the atonement has been effected. But when you're talking about the kinds of offerings whose blood is sprinkled on the inner altar, the incense altar inside the sanctuary, or on the curtain, or between the staves inside the Holy of Holies, there all sprinklings that are required must be executed with correct intention. And if they're not all done correctly, then the priest has achieved nothing on behalf of the people for whom he's bringing the offering. Therefore, if the high priest placed all the placements in their proper manner and one in an improper manner, i.e. with the intent to eat or burn the offering beyond its designated time, then the offering is disqualified, right, because it was never achieved since the sprinklings weren't done correctly. But there is no liability for kares for one who partakes of that offering afterward, meaning it was not rendered pigul. Why? Because it was never permitted for consumption because all the sprinklings weren't done correctly. The Gemara states that we learned in the Mishna there in Tractate Menachos, page 16a, which is our next tractate, with regard to the burning of the handful of a meal offering and the frankincense, both of which render the meal offering permitted for eating. If the priest had an intention that can render the offering pigul, and this occurred during the burning of the handful, but not during the burning of the frankincense, or during the burning of the frankincense, but not during the burning of the handful, i.e. he burned one of them with the intention of eating the remainder of the offering beyond its designated time, but the other one he executed correctly, then Rabbi Meir says the offering is pigul and one who eats it is liable to receive kares. But this is the minority opinion. And the rabbis who overrule Rabbi Meir say there is no liability for kares in this case unless he renders the offering pigul during the performance of the entire permitting factor, meaning all the indispensable elements that would permit the parts of that offering to be eaten. When we're talking about a meal offering, right, the handfuls of flour, then it's both of the handful and the frankincense. And unless both of those are done with correct intent, it won't be available for eating. Therefore, to render it pigul, you would have to have the poor intention, the mistaken intention to eat some of it beyond its designated time during both the pulling of the handful and the burning of the frankincense. The burning of the handful, right? He takes that handful out of the meal offering and then puts it on the altar, and he adds frankincense. Both of those are burned, and he would have to have the incorrect intent during both of those rites, the burning of the handful and the burning of the frankincense, to render a meal offering pigul. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, do not say that the reason of Rabbi Meir, who holds that the offering is pigul, is that he holds in general that one renders an offering pigul even if he intended to eat or burn the offering beyond its designated time during the performance of only half a permitting factor. Rather, what are we dealing with here? We are dealing with a case where he initially placed the handful of the meal offering on the altar to burn it with the improper intention to eat the remainder beyond its designated time, and afterward he placed the frankincense on the altar silently, i.e. without any particular intent. So Rabbi Meir holds anyone who performs an action performs it with his initial intent. Therefore, his action with the frankincense is considered to have been performed with the same improper intention as his action with the handful. So it's really Rabbi Meir is saying that because, unless he changes his intent, the same intent continues. He had improper intent in both the burning the frankincense and the handful. The fact that he was silent on the second burning doesn't excuse it, because we're going to carry forward the improper intent that he had in the first rite. The Gemara asks, from where does Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish learn that this is so? He learns it from the fact that the Mishnah teaches, therefore, if he placed all the placements in their proper manner and one in an improper manner, the offering is disqualified, but there is no liability for kares. So consequently, it follows that if he initially placed one placement in an improper manner with the intent to eat or burn the offering beyond its designated time, and all the other placements in the proper manner, the offering is pigul. And the Gemara explains, whose opinion is this? If we say it is the opinion of the rabbis, don't the rabbis explicitly say that one cannot render an offering pigul with an improper intention in the performance of only half of the permitting factor, right? That's why if you had improper intent during the first sprinkling on the external altar, that's the permitting factor, right? And then if he had proper intention in the other three sprinklings, it might still be pigul, at least according to some opinions. But here, when we're talking about internal sprinklings, right, on the inner altar, where all of the sprinklings are equally required, and likewise burning the handful and burning the frankincense of a meal offering, right? All of these taken together become the permitting factor so that consumption is later allowed. You would have to have the pigul intent in all of them. So here, the priest placed one placement in the proper manner. Rather, it must represent the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that if he had an improper intention with regard to the handful and not the frankincense, the offering is still pigul, not because it's half a factor, but because we're going to project the same intent from the first rite to the second when he was silent. And if Rabbi Meir's reason is that he holds in general that one renders an offering pigul even during the performance of only half of the permitting factor, even if the priest acted as it taught in the Mishna, the offering should also be pigul, as he had an improper intention during half the permitting factor. Rather, it is Rabbi Meir's reason not because he holds that anyone who performs an action performs it with the initial intent. Consequently, if he placed the first placement with an improper intention, the offering is pigul. And if his intention during the first placement was proper, the offering is not pigul. This assumes in both cases that he's silent on the second placement, or the second factor. So Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak says, actually it is possible that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, the majority, who maintain that one cannot render an offering pigul with an improper intention during half a permitting factor. And what is the meaning of the term in their proper manner in the context of the Mishnah? It means in their proper manner with regard to pigul, i.e. he placed the blood with an intention that renders the offering pigul. So the Mishnah is teaching that although he placed the first placements with an improper intention, one does not say that the last placement, which was placed without any specific intention, was performed with his initial intent. Unlike Rabbi Meir, the rabbis don't project the intent from the first placement onto later placements. The Gemara raises a difficulty with this analysis. But from the fact that it teaches, quote, therefore, if he placed all the placements in their proper manner and one in an improper manner, the offering is disqualified, but there is no liability for karas, which indicates that the offering is disqualified due to the one placement performed improperly, but it was not rendered pigul. So one can learn by inference that the term in their proper manner comes to indicate an intention that renders the offering fit and not an intention that renders it pigul, right? Proper means you did it correctly. You put it in the right place, you did it at the right time, and you didn't have an improper intention. Rava says it can still be explained that the term in their proper manner is referring to an intent that actually creates pigul. Proper meaning proper if you wanted to create pigul. Strange use of language according to this interpretation. And what then is the meaning of improper? This is referring to the intent to eat the offering outside its designated area. This intention serves to disqualify the offering, which means that it is not pigul, as not all its rites have been performed in the proper manner. Rav Ashi says the term in an improper manner in the Mishnah means that he placed one placement not for the sake of the offering being sacrificed, but for the sake of some other offering, right? That's what we learned in chapter 1, and that would render it disqualified. And in the case of a sin offering, an intention of this kind disqualifies the offering entirely. You don't even finish the process. Therefore, it cannot be pigul. Now, the Gemara raises a difficulty. If so, one can learn by inference that when the priest does not perform the last placement with the intent to eat the offering outside its designated area, or not for the sake of the offering, but rather he has no intent, he's silent, so then he becomes liable, as the offering is pigul. This is certainly not in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, as they maintain that one cannot render an offering pigul with an improper intention during half of a permitting factor. It has to be all the permitting factors. So the Gemara answers, the wording of the Mishnah is not precise. As in fact, even if he placed the last placement silently, the offering is not pigul. But since the Tana of the Mishnah taught in the first clause with regard to an offering whose blood is placed on the external altar, if he placed the first placement with the intent to eat the offering beyond its designated time, and the second placement with the intent to eat it outside its designated area, the offering is pigul, because the first one was the permitting factor. There he had the improper intent with regard to time, and that's what rendered it pigul. And one would be liable to receive kares if he then ate of that offering, which had been rendered pigul. If he ate of it, the consequence would be kares. And so the Tana of the Mishnah likewise taught the latter clause with regard to a sin offering whose blood is placed on the inner altar in a similar manner, that if he placed the last placement with the intent to eat it outside its designated area or not for the sake of the offering is disqualified, but there is no liability for kares for its consumption because it did not become pigul. So therefore, one cannot infer from here that if he placed the last placement with no intent at all, the offering is pigul. That doesn't create pigul. The Gemara raised an objection to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish from a baraisa. In what case is this statement that the offering is rendered pigul even when he intends to eat it beyond its designated time only in the first placement said? In the case of blood that is placed on the external altar, where one placement renders the offering permitted and therefore improper intent during one placement can render it pigul. Now we're on page 42a. But with regard to the blood placed inside, i.e. in the Holy of Holies, on the curtain, and on the inner altar, for example, the 43 presentations of the blood of the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur, and the 11 presentations of the blood of the bull for an unwitting sin of an anointed priest, and the 11 presentations of the blood of the bull for an unwitting communal sin, if in those cases, right, well, why would we have 11? Because 4 on the corners of the altar and 7, I don't know if those are on the altar, more likely on the curtain, that would be 11 presentations. And the 43 presentations of the blood of the bull and goat on Yom Kippur, because there's so much stuff the high priest is doing on Yom Kippur, 1 and 1 and 2 and 1 and 1 and 2 and 3. If you remember the achas that we count on Yom Kippur, 43 presentations of that mixed blood of the goat and bull. Okay, so there's all these presentations, and remember, inner offerings, all their presentations have to be done. If they're not all done, then you've done the priest has accomplished nothing. Therefore, if you're going to render it pigul, presumably he would have to have improper intention to consume the offering beyond its designated time during all of those presentations, right? That's what we've learned so far. So about this, let's just read that again. But with regard to the blood that is placed inside, i.e. inside the Holy of Holies, on the curtain and on the inner altar, for example, the 43 presentations of the blood of the bull and goat of Yom Kippur, and the 11 presentations of the blood of the bull for an unwitting sin of an anointed priest, and the 11 presentations of the blood of the bull for an unwitting communal sin, if in those cases the priest had an intention that can render the offering pigul, whether during the first set of presentations, whether during the second set, or whether during the third set, i.e. in any of the requisite sets of presentations, Rabbi Meir says the offering is pigul and one is liable to receive karet if he consumes of it. But the rabbis say there is no liability for kares unless he had an intention that can render the offering pigul during the performance of the entire permitting factor. And when we're talking about inner offerings, that means all the sprinklings, right? All the presentations. In any event, this baraisa teaches if the priest had an intention that can render the offering pigul, whether during the first set of presentations, whether during the second, or whether during the third, and yet Rabbi Meir disputes the ruling of the rabbis and says the offering is pigul. So if the priest's intent renders the offering pigul, whether it was during the first, second, or third set of presentations, so evidently Rabbi Meir's ruling must be based on the consideration that one can render an offering pigul during less than the full permitting factor. It's not just about extending what his intent was to the other presentations. It must be that Rabbi Meir will accept a designation of pigul with improper intent on less than the full set of presentations. That's what we've just proven. So according to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's claim, the Rabbi Meir's reason is that anyone who performs an action performs it with his initial intent, that we project that intent on the other rights, that if he had no intent, the offering should be pigul only if the first set of presentations was performed with an improper intention while the rest were performed silently. Since Rabbi Meir said it's enough if he did it in the second but didn't do it in the first, it must be that Reish Lakish is wrong about Rabbi Meir's reasoning. So Rav Yitzchak bar Avin says, what are we dealing with here? We are not dealing with a case of a priest who had improper intention in the presentations themselves, where the issue of half a permitting factor is relevant. Rather, we are dealing with a case where he had an improper intention that can render the offering pigul during the act of slaughter. Right? Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avin says, you guys are completely at sea. You've been talking about the wrong thing entirely. Rabbi Meir's ruling has nothing to do with the presentations. The slaughter is the slaughter. There's no multiple slaughter, right? There's only, although we did see when we were discussing the shechting, that some of the sages will make a distinction between when the blade begins to cut, to slaughter the animal's, jugular and windpipe, and when it finishes. But generally, we hold that an act of slaughter is one act. There's no multiple actions of the slaughter. There's one. And so it must be that Rabbi Meir is saying, okay, well, if he had the wrong intent when he's slaughtering, that's when pigul kicks in. Well, what's the novelty there? We know that. We've known that all along, right? That if the one slaughtering, and it doesn't have to be a priest when we're talking about shechting, about slaughter, if he had intent to consume part of that offering, whether by eating or burning, beyond its designated time, at the time of slaughter, pigul, right? So what's the novelty of what Rav Yitzchak bar Avin is saying? Rather, we're dealing with a case where he had an improper intention that could render an offering pigul during the act of slaughter. In other words, after presenting the blood of the bull inside the sanctuary, the rest of the blood spilled, and he had to slaughter another bull. That's how we get into, more than one slaughter. He had to slaughter another bull so that he could continue with the presentations, this time on the curtain. And the reason for Rabbi Meir's ruling is that the act of slaughter is one permitting factor, and therefore the priest's improper intent involved an entire service, not half a permitting factor. So the Gemara asks, if so, what is the reason for the ruling of the rabbis? If that's what Rabbi Meir is talking about, why would the majority overrule him on that? Wouldn't they certainly agree? And Rava says, when you say the rabbis, who are these rabbis? This is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, as we learned in a Mishna on page 109b, with regard to the handful of a meal offering, right, a mincha, and the frankincense which will accompany it, and the incense, and the meal offering of priests, and the meal offering of the anointed priest, and the meal offering brought with libations that accompany animal offerings. In a case where one sacrificed even an olive bulk, a ketzayas, from any one of these, which should be sacrificed on the altar, but he did it instead outside the temple, he is liable, as the burning of an olive bulk is considered burning. So if something he was supposed to burn on the altar, he burned it outside the temple, then he violated the prohibition on bringing offerings outside the temple, and that's only going to be triggered if you satisfied the requirement of a minimum amount. That's what we're talking about, the olive bulk, okay? And Rabbi Eliezer deems him exempt unless he sacrifices the whole, right, all of it, of any one of these items outside the temple. Rabbi Eliezer is saying, no, not the minimum measure. It's only going to trigger liability for bringing an offering outside the temple if he brings the whole meal offering outside the temple, not this minimum measure. So this indicates that according to Rabbi Eliezer, Even when one performs a proper action, he is not liable unless he completes the service. So the same should apply to the slaughter of different bulls for different sets of presentations. One should be liable only if he rendered each of them pigul. Now the Gemara raises a difficulty. How can you explain Rabbi Eliezer's opinion with regard to the presentation of the blood in this manner? But doesn't Rava say, and Rabbi Eliezer concedes with regard to blood, that even one who sacrifices part of the blood outside the temple is liable? Where do you get that Rabbi Eliezer requires the entirety to be sacrificed outside to trigger this kind of liability, when we see another ruling of his which does not require that the entirety of this portion of the service be done outside the temple, and yet he ascribes liability to the one doing it? As we learned in a Mishna, Tractate Yoma 60a, that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon say, if the blood of the bull or goat of Yom Kippur spilled, even if this occurred in the middle of one of the sets of sprinklings, and the high priest slaughtered another animal, nevertheless, from the place that he interrupted the particular rite when the blood spilled, there he resumes performance of that rite. Therefore, in Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, each individual sprinkling in each of these rites is an act in and of itself, and therefore the offering can be rendered pigul through any one of them. And this is certainly not the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Meir and the Baraisa, because the rabbis say to render it pigul, you'd have to have that improper intention in all the presentations, not just some of them. So, rather, Rava says, Reish Lakish would explain that the Baraisa does not mean that the priest had an improper intention either during the first set of sprinklings or the second or the third. Instead, this is referring to a case where the high priest had an improper intention that can render the offering pigul during the first set of sprinklings in the Holy of Holies, and then he was silent during the second set of sprinklings on the curtain, and again he had an improper intention that can render the offering pigul during the third set of sprinklings on the inner altar. There is a certain novelty in this case, according to the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who maintains that anyone who performs an action performs it with his initial intent. So we would extend that from the first sprinklings to the second. And then we don't need to extend to the third, because then he had the improper intent again at the third set. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Rava explains, lest you say that if it enters your mind that when the priest performs the second set of sprinklings, he does so with his initial intent, i.e. that which he had at the time of the first set of sprinklings, why do I need him once again to have an improper intention that can render the offering pigul during the third set? Why can't I just extend the improper intent of the first to the second and extend it again to the third? Doesn't his explicit intent during the third set of sprinklings indicate that he did not have this intent during the second set? In fact, having it during the third set would seem to undermine that extending it from the first to the second. Therefore, the Baraisa teaches us that this is not so, but rather his silence during the second set is considered a continuation of his initial intent. Rav Ashi objects to this. Is it taught that he was silent during the second set of sprinklings? According to Rava's interpretation, this is the key detail of the case, and yet it was never mentioned in the Baraisa. Where are you getting this? So rather, Rav Ashi said, what are we dealing with here? We are dealing with a case where the high priest had an intention that can render the offering pigul during the first set of sprinklings in the Holy of Holies, and during the second set on the curtain, and during the third on the corners of the inner altar. We are talking about Yom Kippur here. But during the fourth set, the sprinklings on the top of the inner altar, he was silent. 4 sets. And you had the right intent, or the improper intent that would render it pigul. He had that intent in the first 3 sets, and then he was silent on the fourth. Lest you say that if it enters your mind to say that anyone who performs an action performs it with his initial intent, why do I need him once again to have an improper intent that can render the offering pigul during each and every one of the first 3 sets? If you keep saying he has the improper intent, it must be because we can't project from the first one to the second, from the second to the third. Therefore, the Baraisa teaches us that even so, he is considered to have performed all the sprinklings with his initial intent. Now we're on page 42b, and I'm truly almost done. And it appears there are no questions. Okay, the Gemara raises a difficulty. How can Rav Ashi explain the Baraisa as referring to a case where the high priest had an improper intention during the first, second, and third sets of sprinklings? But doesn't the Baraisa teach if the priest had an intention that can render the offering pigul, whether during the first set of presentations, whether during the second set, or whether during the third set? And this indicates that he did not have improper intent during all the sprinklings, but only in part of them. And the Gemara comments, indeed, this is difficult, as the wording of the Baraisa does not suit this interpretation. We'll stop there. And I think one lesson we could take from this, right, as they, as they keep challenging the assumptions that the previous sage is making, just because so often in life, you say, well, he said this, he must have meant that. And they're like, well, he could have said that and meant this other thing. There's no proof that he meant that. He might have meant this, right? Or he said this and then he acted as if he meant that when he went to the next, part of his day. And he, let's say it was a criminal case and this guy said, I hate so-and-so. And then later that day, he ran over so-and-so. So it'd be like, well, since he stated or in the morning that he hates, Joe, and then in the afternoon he ran over Joe, it must be that he intentionally ran over Joe. And then we would come and say, no, you can't make that assumption. Not at all. Maybe he had anger against Joe in the morning. Maybe by the afternoon he had forgotten all about that anger and he was distracted, or he had a heart attack, or there was a bee in the car, and that caused the accident to happen. You can't project that, right? And then we would start introducing other factors, and this idea about questioning assumptions, I think is a good lesson we can take with us from today's daf. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Saturday night. It's getting earlier and earlier. And then next week it's going to jump, right? Because I think the clocks change this Sunday early morning. So I think last week I got, I think Shabbos is now ending like 7:40, so try to be on the air by 8:30, maybe even earlier. Something like that tomorrow night. We should have a sweet Shabbos, please God. Go into it hearing good news, hear good news during Shabbos, and come out of it hearing only good news.